on that. This is Lynn Fraser with the Kilby Center for Recovery. I'm here with Dr. David Best. He's a criminologist, and he's done a lot of research into recovery and recovery capital. Let's have him introduce himself a little bit more thoroughly, and we'll get right into the interview about addiction.
It's a pleasure to be here. My name is David Best. I have 3 titles. I am Professor of Criminology at Sheffield Hallam University. I'm Honorary Associate Professor of Addiction Studies at Monash University in Melbourne. And I'm Honorary Professor of Regulation and Global Governance at Australian National University in Canberra. However, probably more relevant to this discussion than any of that is the fact that over the course of the last 10 or 12 years, I've probably collected something like 1,800 recovery stories in Scotland, in England, in Wales, in Australia, and in America. So I'm fairly well qualified, I think, to be able to comment on how people recover and why they recover and what some of the big challenges are around that people need to overcome to sustain a recovery journey.
That's wonderful. So why don't we go right into that? What are you seeing as some of the challenges? And then we'll get into how people really move into recovery.
Okay, so let me start with the one rule. I think there's only one clear rule that I've been able to uncover, which is nobody does it alone. In all of those stories, no recovery journey. People try at various stages. Various people will lock themselves away in apartments with tins of soup and DVDs, and inevitably things go wrong. Recovery for me has 3 kinds of meanings. There's a personal journey of change and growth. There's a social thing that's about recognition and interpersonal change and growth. And then there's the third level, which in some ways is the most interesting thing, which is recovery as a kind of social movement for change, almost akin to gay rights, as a kind of equality movement that's about championing something that I think has had a stigmatized status and people are still incredulous of. But I think there's increasing recognition. And in my office, I have a proclamation, a recovery proclamation signed by Barack Obama, who issued a couple of recovery proclamations asserting the importance of recovery. And it seems to me that one of the things I'm involved in just now is something called the Recovery Cities Initiative, where along with Ghent in Belgium and Gothenburg in Sweden, Doncaster, which is the city next to Sheffield, is pushing for this notion of recovery as the driving force for social justice, so that recovery isn't an end in itself, but a mechanism for improving civic participation, for increasing social justice, for challenging some of those narrow, stigmatizing, excluding approaches and views to life.
Well, it makes sense that shame and stigma really make addiction worse, and really one of the major drivers of addiction, along with trauma.
And it strikes me that we published a paper a decade ago now, which basically said when people start recovery journeys, typically because they are sick of the life and the lifestyle, and then a trigger event occurs that makes them decide they're going to initiate that process. But what keeps people down that road is other people moving away from using networks and moving into networks that are supportive of change. And a lot of my work has been around both how people change their networks and how, through changing their networks, they change their identity, how they see themselves, how they present themselves. But to some extent, that process is scaffolded by societal responses, so that if society effectively bars them, stops people getting good jobs, good houses, college courses, then there are limits to what is possible. And so something that we know from people trying to get back in after a life of crime is there's this 3-part process. One is the personal change. The second is the social change and acceptance, and the third is the societal reintegration and reabsorption, and that all three of those things effectively can create a virtuous circle in places where there are structural barriers. And I think in the US is probably the single best example of where this happens. And it's very difficult for people, no matter how motivated and driven they are, to manage that third stage, because labels attach, and labels are corrosive and damaging and prevent people from changing.
So tell us about recovery cities. I'm not familiar with that.
No, it's based on an idea around restorative justice. And restorative justice is a concept that really emerged in the 80s and 90s through the work of criminologists John and Valerie Braithwaite in Australia. And they were of the view that the criminal justice system didn't have to be adversarial, that it could be victim focused, it could be healing, it could be restorative. And so they started with kind of alternative approaches to criminal justice resolutions. But then that process has expanded through their work into things like educational processes, industrial process, government process, where conflict resolution much more generally can be more inclusive. Right. And Canberra in Australia, along with a couple of British cities, Leeds and Hull, led the way with this idea of saying, well, this could become a way that cities are run, that problems are managed across cities. And I thought this was an astonishing idea, and I really liked the idea, and it struck me that recovery could be the same. Now, we published something called the UK Life and Recovery Survey in 2015, and I believe Canada published its Life and Recovery Survey last year or the year before. Anyway, what we found was that people who make it to 5 years or more in recovery, 80% of them actively volunteer or participate in their local communities, compared to around 40% of the general public.
Wow,
so long-term recovery are twice as likely to be the glue that holds their local streets and communities together. So wanting people to achieve that journey is kind of almost selfish. It benefits you if it happens. And so one of the messages for us is that getting the message out there that people who you can help to that process of change will actually give back far more than you give to them. And that model of restoration and support pays for it. It pays for itself by making the community richer. And in my kind of notion of recovery capital, it's a positive sum game. That it's not the case that what's given to people to support recovery costs. It creates. And it creates hope. And I'm currently writing a book at the moment about recovery and community. And the title of the book is The Social Contagion of Hope. And effectively what I see is happening is where recovery takes hold, there's a kind of contagion of social justice, there's a contagion of connection and connectedness that goes way, way beyond the key individuals that are part of this process.
So how do you get communities to, well, let alone countries, to see the long-term game here, that it's worth investing short-term to gain all?
Yeah, again, I go back to my kind of academic hero, who's a man called John Braithwaite, and he argued that for justice, cities or communities can be either reintegrative in their shaming mechanisms or disintegrative. And sex offenders are a great example. What happens to sex offenders? They are labelled. And once they are labelled, they find it very hard to shake those labels. Nobody believes sex offenders stop. So they typically will go underground and hide or disappear. Now, I'm not for a second drawing any parallels, but similar processes arise, similar underlying mechanisms arise, where if you, for a community to be just and not to have a massive marginalized, excluded group who have no other option but to reoffend and return to substance use, you have to then create the circumstances, what we call a therapeutic landscape for recovery, where essentially through a process of contagion that starts with people who've successfully recovered themselves, family members, professionals, and community leaders, we create a kind of coalition of hope that's about spreading that word, identifying community assets to engage people in the recovery with, creating bridges to those assets. So one of the projects I do at the moment is with prisons in the northwest of England. For people with alcohol problems coming out of prisons in the last 6 months of their sentence, we get the family members in and we get the prisoners to talk about all the stuff they've been good at and that they would like to do. And one of the things that we get from people who've been in jail for 10 years or 15 years is they say, nobody's ever asked me what I'm good at and what I like to do. But what we then try and do is we set the family members homework of saying, you find some of the places and groups and organizations that do that in your community, and you try and establish bridges. So there are genuine links to social capital, to community resources that are available. And part of that process is for the connector is not just to persuade the ex-prisoner to go along to the fishing club or the, I don't know, whatever art group, but to convince the group to accept and engage. And in fact, ideally, to convince some people from the group to come to the prison and meet the person before they come out, to make that bridge real. And that is, in essence, for me, the nature of community connections, and that's community asset building. So that I guess the crime prevention or the relapse prevention component about this is about saying you create attractive pro-social alternatives to returning to antisocial networks. But the much more important thing is your community building. Effectively, what you are doing is, for each party, you're increasing their commitment to their local community, and you're building social justice in doing it.
That's wonderful. And I can see how once it starts, it would really start to build on itself because everybody could see how effective it is.
Yeah. And as I'm sure you're aware, you know, there's not that many people whose lives haven't been touched by addiction.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that I've always struggled a little bit about parts of the recovery movement is that kind of zealous, puritanical idea that it's only people in recovery who should be in the recovery movement. It seems to me that to maximize the resources, we need family members and we need professionals to form a coalition that can access different groups and different opportunities and different populations, but also that can influence each other. But, you know, they grow through that process. We're not in that kind of warrior down situation where it's only experts by experience struggle themselves to manage themselves, because, you know, this should be a growth process for everyone, including all the professionals in the field. And one of the things that I think is important about this is this notion of managing emotional labor, so that, you know, we are saying to professionals, look, you know, recovery isn't just for your clients, it's for you as well. This is a process of growth and development. And for me, the aim of that is purely about social capital and community capital, building relationships to build communities. And I've switched from in my early work on recovery, I was very clear about this being a kind of personal process of change. But for me now, the mechanisms of change and the outcomes of change should be measured at two levels. They should be measured at the level of networks, and then measured at the level of active community engagement.
Right, and the person heals through that network.
Yeah, that's the mechanism of change.
Yeah.
The person heals and the community grows. And I think the argument for me would be, this is a way in all those issues of, you know, too much Facebook and not enough people talking to their neighbors. Effectively, you utilize the re-engagement of marginalized groups to reinvigorate communities.
Right. And see the value in those people who have been stigmatized and kind of put aside.
Yeah. See the value in those people, see the value in those communities.
Right. So where would people find out more about recovery cities? So if you're, in the US and you don't have anything like that going on?
Come to Gothenburg in Sweden on the 14th and the 15th of May this year, where we have various city mayors from something called Euro Cities who are going to talk about social inclusion and social justice as a model. And we are championing this. We're early stages, so basically we're still in the process of working out what a charter will look like for a recovery city. But basically the idea is that we have 3 cities who have signed up to this model. So and for me, part of this process of creating a recovery-oriented system of care is managing both the top-down strategic buy-in with bottom-up grassroots activities and engagement, and effectively almost utilizing those kind of professional systems and structures in the middle as the targets for change.
Right. I interviewed someone from the Catal Center for Justice last year for the summit, and community organizing is their foundation for everything.
Yeah, and for me also, I mean, it seems to me that if we constantly think of recovery as an individual struggle to overcome adversity, we'll be reinventing the wheel every time we start that process. And right. I'm sure you know that where recovery works well, it's because there's a kind of collective will and a collective energy and a collective commitment. I mean, I'm really excited. For the first time this year, I'm going to go to San Patrignano in Italy, which is a recovery community of 7,000 people. Now, that just strikes me as an incredible thing. Just what a fabulous resource to tap into. And I think we're far too unambitious about these things. I don't see why we can't aim to have entire cities that are predicated on the principle of inclusion, well-being, quality of life, and connectedness. There's in the mental health field, I came across a review paper which used an acronym called CHIME. And CHIME stands for connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And ever since I read that, when I look at any recovery, when I'm asked to evaluate recovery groups or recovery activities, it's always at the forefront of my head. And on day one, I kind of look for evidence of all 5 of those things. And I'm pretty sure if I can find evidence of all 5 of those things, that program will work.
Yeah.
And if I can't, it won't. So it's not complicated. I don't think the science of this is becoming more complicated, but it doesn't need to be, because there are very straightforward principles about generosity of spirit, connection, and engagement that are just underlying all of those processes.
Well, and that's they underline a lot of the 12-step groups too, that social inclusion, connection, validation, not being shamed.
Yeah, and I think one of the things for me is I was involved in setting up 2 recovery groups, one in the UK, the Recovery Academy, and then its equivalent in Australia, Recovery Academy Australia. And for both of them, I really wanted to go for that kind of non-partisan model, to start by saying, look, lots of people recover in different ways. And obviously the 12-step fellowship kind of is the giant that straddles the recovery world. But it's not for everyone, and it's not for everyone all the way through the recovery journeys. I wrote a book about people who worked in the addictions field who were in long-term recovery, and I was amazed how many of them, the catalyst for recovery was going to residential rehabilitation, which was generally a therapeutic community, then engaging in 12-step groups for 2 to 3 years afterwards, and then moving away from both of those things and just getting on with their professional life and their quality. Now, of course, that's not a formula for success, but I think the idea of multiple methods for different people at different times is why the recovery movement has to have a kind of non-partisan quality that doesn't say this is the way to do it.
Right, sure.
There are multiple ways for different people at different times. They will, and to some extent, it will rely entirely on the attractiveness and the charisma of those networks and groups around them. And that varies. And if you go to countries like Australia and America, there tends to be much more skepticism about 12-step than in North America. It doesn't make that right or wrong, but it just means people will need different ways to start that process wherever they get to in the end.
So what would you suggest for an individual who's at some point in his recovery and is interested in what you're saying? Are there websites? Are there ways? What would you suggest for them to start in their own communities too? How would they connect with something like this?
Oh, look, I mean, we did something in Sheffield which was just fascinating. We got a small pot of money from an organization called the Health Foundation. And we went to various recovery and treatment centers and said, look, can we get together some people who are interested in recovery and interested in helping other people? And we recruited 21 people who were community connectors. And we brought them together and we talked to them about the principles of connections and community connections, did a couple of training exercises, and we set them a task over a 1-month period to say, identify assets in your local communities in 4 different domains: sport and recreation, employment, training and education, volunteering and community participation, and mutual aid. And they went out and they utilized the resources they already had, the networks they had, and they identified 134 community resources that they could get people new to recovery into. And that, and that's the process, that's the method. But that group of 21 people becomes a new asset because it's the process, not the count. What we're not looking for is a directory. What we're looking for is a mobilization of assets. And right. So, I'm going to do this in this exercise. I'm going to do this in 2 prisons next Monday. And what I'll do is I'll try and get them to do 3 things. What are the assets within the prison? What are the assets that the prison can link to externally? And what are the bridges? And it'll all be strengths focused. And it will all be about mobilizing that initial group and then using their connections and their connections to build the resource and to mobilize community activity. I'm afraid it's not complicated, nor is it particularly sophisticated. It really is about that contagion of hope and switching from a deficits model to a strengths-based model.
Right. Yeah, that just makes so much sense. Yeah, it's so simple, and it gets right to the root of what the issue is and how to actually heal. And
I'm sure if you work with, as I used to do, with adolescents in Melbourne in Australia, and they finish treatment and they then end up relapsing because they say there's nothing to do. And what it kind of means is, I have no way, I don't currently have the resources, social or personal, to overcome all the barriers in my head, to 1, identify resources, and 2, to access them. Mm-hmm. So our model is predicated on the idea of we provide the assets and we provide the connectors. Our job is simply to get people through the front door and identify people inside that door who will embrace them and engage them and motivate and inspire them. And I can't imagine that any of your communities, like any of ours, doesn't have people who can do that.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And many of them are in recovery, but no. And in my kind of 1800 stories of recovery, most, by no means all, but most, will talk about 1 or 2 core people who are inspirational in their journeys. And I think one of the challenges is to create windows of opportunity for people to find those pivotal internal drivers and external supporters who enable that journey to move forward.
So you mentioned books that you've written. What are some that would be helpful for people to read?
We did an edited collection of papers and essays. I did it with a guy called Jeffrey Roth, who was the editor of Journal of Groups in Addiction and Recovery, and we did a collected volume on recovery in the UK. My most recent book was called Strengths, Solutions and Setbacks, and I've done last year, I did an edited collection called Social Identity and Recovery, which was about how people's identity shifts as part of this recovery process. But the key one is the one that always your best book is the one that's just about to come out. And
Right.
this is the book I'm now towards on the second last chapter, and it'll be out by the summer. And it is genuinely the book I'm most excited about, because it's about this notion of communities that care, that create those conditions to enable and support recovery.
And the name of that book?
The Social Contagion of Hope.
Okay, so that people can keep an eye open for that.
Keep an eye open for that.
Yeah. So thank you so much for the interview. And I love what you're talking about. It's so interesting. And the contagion of hope, I think as people watch this interview, that's what will happen there too. So thank you again.
Perfect. Thank you very much. It was lovely to meet you.
Yes, you too. Go to KillibyCenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit. For access to the interviews, you can watch them free online for 48 hours after they air, or you could purchase an all-access pass. KillibyCenter.com.